Welcome back. Today I'll be going over Ginger Alden's book, Elvis and Ginger. We'll be doing chapter 3. Ginger says in September 1976, the family went to Atlantic City to watch Terry in the Miss America pageant. Ginger says although Terry didn't win the crown, she was immensely proud of her sister. In October of that year, Ginger, who had been crowned Miss Mid-South Fair, served as the fair's official hostess. Before she knew it, October was over. Ginger says most weekends in Memphis, she and her sisters spent their evenings going out to dinner, catching a movie, or spending time with friends. But on Friday, November 19th, 1976, all three of them were actually home. They were sitting in the den with Larry, a young man that Ginger was dating, when the phone rang. Her mom answered, and she answered the phone in the kitchen, and then came into the den to tell them that George Klein was calling for Terry. She says she and her sisters exchanged surprised looks. George Klein was a well-known Memphis DJ and TV host, and more notably, a close friend of Elvis Presley. Terry answered the call in the kitchen while their mother, still looking a bit shocked, explained that George Klein had said Elvis was interested in meeting the new Miss Tennessee, and he invited Terry to Graceland. Ginger says at that point they had only seen Graceland from the outside, so being invited to go inside made the whole thing surreal. She says she and Rosemary rushed to the kitchen to listen in on Terry's phone conversation. She says although Terry was Miss Tennessee, the thought of actually having a, quote, date with Elvis felt something out of a movie. She says Terry had been dating someone since high school, so when Terry accepted the invitation to Graceland, she knew it was simply out of excitement to meet Elvis and to see the inside of Graceland firsthand. Ginger says she and her sisters were very close, and Rosemary suggested that she and Ginger go along so Terry wouldn't have to go alone. Ginger didn't feel right about tagging along simply because they hadn't been personally invited. But before she could object, Rosemary hurried over to Terry, who was still on the phone, and whispered, "Ask George if Ginger and I can come." Terry hesitated for a moment, knowing it wasn't exactly polite to basically invite other people, but she asked anyway, knowing that the sisters, always looked after each other. After a brief pause, Terry lowered the receiver and told them that George had sounded unsure and had put on hold to find out. And Ginger said now they felt embarrassed for asking. When George returned to the call, Terry nodded, signaling yes. He said it was fine for Ginger and Rosemary to come along. So the two rushed to share the news with their mother and Larry. Ginger says Larry wasn't too thrilled about her going to Graceland, but seeing how excited she and everyone was, he said, quote, "I don't blame you for wanting to go." Then he left. After the call, Terry walked back into the den and said Elvis had offered to send a car for them, but she said that she preferred to drive. And George had asked them what kind of car they'd be in so he could alert the guards at Graceland's gates to let them through. They were supposed to be at Graceland that night at 11 p.m. She says they were excited about not only meeting Elvis, but getting to tour the inside of Graceland too, calling it a double treat. As the girls were getting ready, Terry said, "I'm glad you and Rosemary are going." Then, remembering how George seemed hesitant when she asked if her sisters could go too, she added, "I really hope it's all right you're coming with me." Feeling uncertain and not wanting Terry to worry, Ginger stopped getting ready and she walked away. Rosemary noticed and reassured her, saying George said it was fine, then joked the worst thing that could happen is they'd be asked to leave. Ginger says Rosemary was right, so she finished getting ready. By 10:30, they said goodbye to their parents and eagerly headed out. Ginger says Graceland was less than a half hour away, and their excitement filled the car as they talked nonstop. But as they turned onto Elvis Presley Boulevard, the mood shifted to like a quiet awe. She says as they pulled up to the iconic gates of Graceland and it began to slowly open, she could hardly believe this was happening for them. At the guardhouse, Terry gave her name, and then they drove up the long driveway, stopping near Graceland's front porch. The girls weren't sure what to do, so they sat in the car and waited. A security guard approached, and Terry asked him, "What should we do?" The guard smiled and said, "Try knocking on the front door." They burst into laughter at the guard's comment and about how nervous they had been. They got out and climbed the stairs to the front door. Ginger says Rosemary, always the bold one, rang the doorbell beside the green wrought iron door. As they waited, Ginger's nerves returned. Expecting Elvis himself to answer, she couldn't help but worry, what if Elvis really doesn't want Rosemary and me here? She says she was surprised when George Klein opened the door. She thought Elvis would have answered it since it was his home. She says George, who was around Elvis's age at 41, was warm and personable. Ginger recognized him as the host of Talent Party, the show she had once modeled on briefly, though she didn't mention it, assuming he wouldn't remember. After introducing himself, George invited the sisters to come inside. Ginger stepped inside, and she says it was as if she were stepping into another world, entering Graceland for the first time. George led them into the dining room, and as they walked beneath a chandelier, she glanced to her right and caught sight of a red room furnished in French provincial style. There was the peacock stained glass panels, the music room was beyond it, and in the music room was a black baby grand piano. Ginger says, quote, many people have referred to this red decor as gaudy and it would eventually be changed. But gaudy or not, it impressed me at the time, and it's still one of my most lasting memories of Graceland. So in Linda Thompson's book, she says after Elvis passed, someone had reverted the interior back to its classic colors. And she said that she felt that it was a mistake. It should have been kept in the same color scheme that Elvis enjoyed. And I agree. I mean, if that's what he liked, I don't know why it would be changed to something that was before, that they didn't keep it as is. I don't understand why they didn't do that. Because I think that regardless of what the interior looks like, whoever had the idea to change it back to its classical look, I don't think it would have affected, had they left it in the red decor, I don't think it would have affected people wanting to go see Graceland, just based off the colors. So I think that they did Elvis a disservice by changing it from what he liked to what maybe he or Gladys preferred, whoever set it up when they first moved in. Anyway, Ginger says from her left came the sound of voices. When she looked, she saw several people seated around a mirrored dining table in red silver studded chairs. She says there was someone sitting in the chair at the end of the table with its back facing them, and she thought, this must be Elvis. But it wasn't. George introduced the man as Gigi Gamble, along with his wife Patsy Presley, Elvis's cousin, and to another cousin, Billy Smith, and Billy's wife, Jo. She says the group was relaxed. They were playing cards, the men were smoking cigars, and everyone dressed casually. She says everyone greeted them cordially, but Ginger sensed a hint of curiosity in their eyes, as if they were quietly sizing up the newcomers. Ginger says she and her sisters had dressed nicely for the occasion, wanting to look presentable for Elvis, but not to the point of trying too hard to impress anyone. She says George led the sisters through Graceland's kitchen, which surprised Ginger with its wall-to-wall multicolored carpet. She had never seen a kitchen that was carpeted. Come to think of it, I haven't either. I've never seen a kitchen with carpet in it. She says the kitchen opened into a den, which George introduced as the jungle room. And while they were there, George answered a green phone that was buzzing. Ginger heard laughter from the dining room, and she realized how at home everyone felt there. George hung up the phone and said, can you please wait right here? Elvis isn't ready yet. He's practicing karate. And then he walked out, leaving the sisters alone in the room. Ginger says she found it a bit strange that Elvis had invited them at a set time and yet hadn't appeared. But she says she didn't mind. She just being inside Graceland was thrilling enough. The girls sat down and a maid came in and offered them drinks. When the maid left to get sodas for them, Ginger noticed cameras on the walls near the ceiling. She pointed the cameras out to her sisters and wondered if they were being watched. And the maid brought their drinks back, and she says after that they were very cautious of every move they made. Ginger said that given how late it was, she was surprised by how lively Graceland felt. Phones buzz now and then. She says they didn't ring, they actually buzzed. Ginger says a young man in his 20s with long blonde hair walked into the jungle room and introduced himself as Elvis's brother, Ricky Stanley. Ginger says she was confused. She hadn't known Elvis had any siblings, and she later learned that Ricky was actually his stepbrother. Ricky's mom, Dee, had married Vernon after Gladys Presley's passing. So, side note, I don't know much about Dee Stanley other than what was written in Anita Woods' book and Priscilla's book. I haven't really done a lot of research on her yet, but I do remember watching a video a few years ago. It was an old video. Dee was on a talk show. Like, I can't remember what talk show it was, but she was making some pretty horrific accusations about Elvis and his mother, Gladys. And I was just thinking, oh my gosh, who is this lady? To make these types of statements and show evidence, like, where are you getting this information from? It was so insane to me. Anyway, Ginger says Ricky and the girls chatted briefly, and Ginger found out Ricky worked as one of Elvis's aides. She says soon after, a short, dark-haired man in his 40s entered the room and introduced himself as Charlie Hodge. He was holding a drink in one hand and a cigarette in the other, and he began cracking off-colored jokes. Ginger says, quote, "If Elvis was considered the king of rock and roll, I thought Charlie would certainly qualify as his court jester. I wondered if he'd been sent expressly to entertain us." She says she would later learn that Charlie sang harmony and helped Elvis on stage. Then George Klein came in and said, "Elvis is still practicing karate. Would you like to see downstairs?" He led them down a staircase at the back of the den where he showed them the pool room. Not swimming pool, but billiards pool. She says next George took them to what he called the TV room. And she says the moment she stepped inside, she felt slightly disoriented. The room was filled with mirrors everywhere on the ceiling, framing the fireplace, and even covering a square coffee table. In the TV room was a bar, and built into one wall were 3 television screens. Painted above the couch was a large white lightning bolt set against navy and yellow clouds. And George explained that it represented Elvis's personal motto, TCB, taking care of business, with the lightning bolt symbolizing taking care of business lightning fast. Ginger says, just then a phone in the room started buzzing. George answered, listened, and then hung up. He told them that they were heading upstairs next to Elvis's daughter's room. Ginger began to get excited again. Since they'd already explored nearly every part of the downstairs, she realized what this meant, that Elvis must be upstairs. They were finally going to meet him. As George began climbing the stairs, Ginger says her heart pounded harder with every step. At the top, they followed him down a hallway into Lisa's bedroom. A black leather sofa lined one wall, while the centerpiece of the room was a large, round bed covered in white faux fur with a matching canopy. She says she and her sister sat on the sofa as George switched on a nearby television. George chatted with them until Ricky and Billy Smith came in and joined the conversation. Ginger checked her watch, and she was surprised to see it was almost 1 a.m. They'd been at Graceland for 2 hours already. She began to wonder if the men were stalling for Elvis. She wondered if Elvis had changed his mind about meeting them and thought that they might be sent home. She says someone appeared in the doorway and she thought it was another relative or friend, but it was Elvis. Ginger says, quote, "I was caught off guard. I had halfway been expecting to hear trumpets sound at his entrance." She said Elvis's hair was styled casually and he was wearing a simple outfit, a dark blue karate top, black pants, and black boots. She says she was immediately attracted to him, and her shyness flew right out the window. She blurted, "Hi, Elvis," as if they were old friends. He said hi and shook their hands. She says someone had obviously told him which sister was who, because he called each of them by name. Elvis sat in a chair and lit a cigar with Billy's help before apologizing for the delay. After Billy left, Elvis began talking with Terry, asking about her background. She shared details about her music and pageant titles. Then Elvis asked Ginger, "How about you? Have you won any titles?" Ginger answered, and then he asked Rosemary if she wanted any titles. Rosemary explained she hadn't entered any pageants outside of high school, and he smiled and said, well, you should have, but for now, you'll just have to be misunderstood. Ginger and her sisters laughed along with Elvis. She was quickly realizing how naturally his sense of humor matched theirs. Ginger says, quote, I'd had this feeling of a powerful presence and energy the minute Elvis entered the room, and he continued to hold my focus completely throughout the night. At the same time, I was taken by how down to earth he was and by his sexy smile and laugh. She says they continued to chat. Elvis talked about how honored he was. The street out front was named after him. He talked about karate, and Ginger mentioned how she wanted to take lessons when she was 16, but her parents thought she was too young. She said that he didn't agree with that. He said, you're never too young to learn karate. She told him how she loved art, but she refrained from mentioning her joy for singing. And she said Rosemary kept Elvis laughing. Then at one point, Ginger says Elvis tilted his head and looked at the floor and said, quote, Ginger, you're burning a hole right through me, end quote. Then she says he looked at her and she said to him, who, me? And he said, yes, you. She wasn't sure what he meant because she didn't feel like she had been staring at him. And then Elvis asked if they wanted to see the rest of the upstairs, and they said yes. As they walked into the hallway, Elvis took the glass of soda Ginger was holding in her hand and took a sip. And he handed it back to her, and she says she was so surprised at this. She accidentally headed the wrong way. She was walking towards the stairs. Elvis placed his hands on her shoulders and turned her towards a set of double doors. And they followed Elvis through his office and into his bedroom. And he had a giant bed that was 9 foot by 9 foot. And the doors in the ceiling were padded. Elvis explained that it was to block out noise when he slept. Then they went back into the office where Elvis played the electric organ and sang, You'll Never Walk Alone. At one point, Ginger looked in the mirror above the organ and saw George yawning. Ricky had left the group by then. She wondered if George yawned because he was tired or if he was bored, and that this was just the common thing that Elvis did. When Elvis was done at the organ, he showed them his closet, which surprised Ginger because she always felt that closets were a personal space. She says the closet was filled with racks of clothing, and there was a bed in the closet too. There was also a bust of the Greek god Apollo, who she thought resembled Elvis. He later told her that he thought the same thing. He showed them some jumpsuits, and he said the fabric used, quote, did not let any air in or out. I wonder why he would prefer this. Like, wouldn't it get hot? Anyway, Elvis began showing his personal clothes as well. She says his casual, quote, casual clothes included fur-collared coats, colorful satin shirts, and hats that, quote, looked like they could have been worn on the set of the movie Shaft. And she wondered if Elvis showed everyone his personal clothes or if he specifically just wanted to show it to them. Ginger says Elvis then excused himself and asked George to follow him. The girls were standing in his closet alone, and they figured the tour was over. Then George appeared and told Ginger Elvis wanted to talk to her for a minute. And she looked over at her sisters, wondering why Elvis would want to see her alone. George said, he's waiting for you. And as she headed towards the bedroom, she noticed George guiding her sisters out of the closet. Ginger says back in Elvis's bedroom, she saw that he was sitting on the side of his bed, and he motioned for her to sit next to him, and she nervously did. She says he smiled and said, did you notice I was paying more attention to you than to your sisters? And Ginger's heart started to race, and as she realized Elvis might be flirting with her, something that she never imagined possible. She says though he had seemed to treat all 3 sisters equally, she began recalling subtle moments like his comment about her burning a hole through him, and him taking a sip from her cup. She told him yes, and he told her, quote, when I like someone, I really like them a lot. It's not just a fling. I don't like one-night stands. And she told him she didn't like them either. He made a gesture toward the window and said, I'm not that street out there, meaning Elvis Presley Boulevard. If you cut me, I bleed. Ginger says she was stunned that Elvis, this charming, world-famous star, was speaking to her so personally. At a loss for words, she simply said, I understand. Elvis said, good. Then he grabbed Cairo's book of numbers and asked for her birth date. When she told him her birthday was November 13th, he explained that made her a number 4 in numerology. And he began reading from the book of numbers about the traits of number 4s. Elvis told her he was a number 8 and went over 8's traits as well. I'm not going to go over the details of the numerology for the sake of time. But Ginger says one line about 8s that stuck out to her was, quote, he said these people were often misunderstood and for this reason felt lonely. Ginger says it was difficult for her to understand how Elvis could feel lonely, especially with all the people surrounding him. She says Elvis grabbed another book and sat further back up the bed and motioned for her to do the same. And at this point, she said she felt comfortable enough now and scooted up next to him with her back on the pillows. Elvis asked her to read from the book, and she did as he took sips of ice water from a glass jar that was on his nightstand. They took turns reading, and then at one point, Elvis got up to go to the bathroom. And Ginger was starting to feel really tired, and she realized that at that point, she had been up for almost 24 hours. She was concerned, too, that Rosemary and Terry were somewhere waiting for her. When Elvis returned from the bathroom, she told him that she should find her sisters and leave because it was late. And she said that she was stunned when Elvis told her that they had already left home earlier. He told her someone would take her home when she was ready. And Ginger says that she figured Elvis was tired too, so she thanked him for the evening, and he called downstairs to arrange for her ride home. And when he hung up, he told her, quote, you should always politely ask someone to do something for you. Never tell a person what to do. Ginger says Elvis then asked her for her phone number, which shocked her. She was shocked that Elvis Presley wanted her phone number. Then she thought of Larry, who hadn't wanted her to go to Graceland, and she said that she felt conflicted, but she gave Elvis her phone number anyway. And Ginger says, quote, as I looked at him, Elvis suddenly leaned in toward me, catching me totally off guard. He kept his hands on the bed and gave me a quick light kiss on the lips. It was so quick I barely had time to register what had just happened, but I was stunned and excited. She says one of Elvis's employees, Steve Smith, drove her home, and she replayed the kiss over and over in her head. When she got home, her mother and sisters were waiting. Terry explained that George Klein had taken her and Rosemary on a tour of the racquetball court and assured them that Ginger would be brought home safely. Ginger says she told them what happened, leaving out the kiss. Ginger says the evening seemed so unreal. She says she'd never met anyone like Elvis. She called him a gentleman, and he was polite and funny. She, quote, felt an intense attraction between us. She says lying in her bed later, she couldn't sleep. She wondered if Elvis would call and what she would do if he did, knowing it could hurt Larry. What was her biggest fear? Elvis being attracted to her and having to let Larry down, or Elvis not calling her at all. Ginger says she admitted to herself that if Elvis didn't call, she'd be really disappointed, and decided that if he did, she would say yes to seeing him again. Sorry, Larry. That's it for Chapter 3. Stay tuned for Chapter 4, where Ginger goes back to Graceland, as well as a surprise trip with Elvis and the first piece of jewelry he gave her. I'll see you then.